Thank you so much, Ramya. That was excellent and very stimulating and inspiring for this Friday morning, but not without a lot of complexity for us all to mull over. Thank you. I'll just remind everyone that you can hold on to your questions. Hopefully there are many coming in Ramya's fascinating talk until after our next speaker, and then we'll be able to bring it all together. So our next speaker is Erling Bjorgvinsson, who is Professor of Design at the Academy of Art and Design, Faculty of Fine Arts at Gothenburg University. A central topic of his research is participatory politics in design and art, in particular in relation to urban spaces and the interaction between public institutions and citizens, as well as the relationship between aesthetics, narrativity, and economics. Professor Bjorgvinsson is currently working on a research project related to spatial imaginaries in relation to migration, which is a topic that should be of interest to, or will definitely be of interest to a number of researchers here at Loughborough, London, and probably Loughborough in the Midlands as well. Erling has published in international design and art journals and anthologies, and is part of the working group for the Art and Design Research journal, PARS. And Erling's talk today is titled Participation as Patronage or Reciprocal Dislocation. Oh, there you go. Sorry. Hello, welcome to So just the oh, is there a clicker?
This one. Thank you for inviting me to come here today. Very happy to be here, and when I was invited to participate in this Flux Symposium, the topic, as has been explained, was to address what was dialogue, difference, and displacement. And in this lecture, I will address this by critically looking back on my own research trajectory. And today, design is called upon to solve large-scale social and environmental problems. Large-scale design approaches often argue that change should happen through dialogue and by acknowledging differences amongst those we design together with. However, such projects seldom lead to fundamental change, and I think that's because they operate within still a modernist logic where aesthetics and politics are separated, and patronage rather than co-working dictates the modes of being together. So through a set of design research projects I have been involved in, I will question common assumptions related to change, dialogue, and difference, and ask if reciprocal dislocation can be a way out of the impasse of current design still plagued by modernist ideas, and I think also historical amnesia. So the first project I will be talking about is a project I did in 2007 on street journalism with youth organizations. And here I will be highlighting a question of dialogue and patronage. And I think here dislocation was not reciprocal at all. It was dislocating the participants. So it was a failed project, you could say. First of all, I cannot think of any design that is not dialogical. The question is what type of dialogue practices should we engage in? And as Mahmoud Keshevarz argues, design is often seen in the form of discrete objects, where what are deemed innovative objects appear as separate from the social material culture they are dependent on and embedded in. And he states, I have a quote here, no, Design themes do not come into existence through an isolated act of design or a single policy. Technologies, practices, and rationalities merge into each other through the act of designing. The act of designing articulates them in a new form seen and understood as product, services, or system. These ways and processes are presented and accepted in certain moments as principal component of modernity, capitalism, colonialism, and neoliberalism. Thus, they come to be seen as natural and self-evident bounded whole, which is designed, produced, and consumed in the name of innovation, progress, reason, and rationality, and as an indispensable part of the status quo. Thus, all design is socio-materially dialogical, entering dialogues already going on. So the question is, what aspects, what dialogues are we highlighting that we call innovative, or that we call new, or so forth? And as Keshawars further argues, we therefore need to ask what counts as design, who counts as designer, whose design is legitimized, who needs others' design, and who has the power to refuse being subject of designing also. Because there are a lot of people being called upon to be the subject of design today. So to critically discuss patronage and participation, I will now turn to the project I did in 2008 and 2007, where we had good intention and wished to side with the so-called marginalized and vulnerable, where I will focus on problematic aspects of collaborative design when we were working on kind of mobile media journalism, public sphere issues, and with the aim of to decrease exclusion. The project is a case where the participatory design was deployed to connect to what the youth leader and the youth organization members themselves called a multi-ethnic music organization from Rosengård in Malmö. And Malmö is the most contested city in Sweden because it's the most multicultural city of Sweden. Well, Fox News was there around this time and had this this news about Malmö, that the Muslims were taking over Malmö. So that was the image from that was being painted upon Malmö at the time. So beside the multi-ethnic music organization, the participants were a mid-sized media company and national actors at the Swedish radio and Swedish television. The project was carried through by Malmö Living Labs for co-production, social innovation and new media based at Malmö University, where I was working at the time. Which was a research environment that engaged in creating common spaces where private, public, and civic actors should collaborate together in relation to cultural production. The lab work was based on an aesthetic political perspective that favored ways of working where marginalized cultural producers such as young music artists were brought into partnership with established, strong public and private actors by means of participatory methods. I was part of this lab, which ran between 2007 and was first funded by a Swedish agency and then by EU fund. The collaboration presented here is one of the many the researchers conducted with the music grassroots organization, and we were trying to go away from kind of projectification and thinking about kind of creating infrastructures for co-production. It explored grassroots media, mobile media broadcast production in connection to Musikhjälpen, which is a music aid project, which is this is the only image from the project that I would show. I had a bunch of other images, but I decided to anonymize the case. And so they would have profiled kind of media and artists, people sitting there for a week and playing music, and people could donate money. And then they wanted to have activities around the box to attract people. And a mid-sized media company, they won the bid to have the event, and we would do it together, and they would be doing kind of street journalism. And this was also to highlight kind of grassroots initiatives in Malmö. But one of the issues prior to the launch, because we were working in a kind of infrastructural way, and we had many different things together with this youth organization, was that there was another bit also going on with just the leader, where the idea, and the mid-sized company had the idea that they were pitching to the Swedish television about the series that would be run around Rosengård. So the project became quite complex. You have all these actors, and you had two agendas. And there became a conflict in the project between these two agendas. So one agenda was that the mobile broadcast would be branded with logo and internet address and so forth with the youth organization. But because SVT had said that they felt that the leader was too inexperienced, the bid was that it should be branded according to his name. And this bid won. Some of the researchers, I was against it, some other researchers were for it, and so forth. And this created a conflict between, you get what I'm saying? So this created a tension and conflict within the environment. And also what happened was that there was a conflict around a mosque that was being fired from their vicinities. And so there was like burning of cars in the area at the time we were doing the project. And this made the public television attack the area, the municipality attacked the youth organization because they wanted them to prove that they were doing more than, because they wanted to be able to say to the public television that we're doing a lot of destructive things. So they accused the youth organization of not doing enough, which was untrue. And so forth. So it became an extremely complicated place to be in. So in hindsight, and actually this conflict led to when many of the youth in the organization saw that the whole site was being branded according to with the name of the leader. They called for a meeting, and it was shut down, which I think is understandable, because they felt that we had not listened to them or represented them. So in practice, the participation and the process of linking different actors generated new vulnerabilities amongst the most marginal individuals in the organization. This, however, did not stop those who were badly affected from actively pushing back. A faction of the organization rightly demanded that the specially designed broadcast webpage channel for the event, designed for and based on the identity of one of the leaders, be shut down. The branding, the naming of the internet domain, the logo and the structuring of a website had come about through the exclusion of the youngsters from participating in design and development process. The case, although framed as giving voice and empowering the marginal participants to connecting them to normative and powerful actors, was violent and unjust in its realpolitik. It assumed that the organization consisted of unified subjects and homogeneous members, that one of the leaders could represent the whole organization. The vulnerabilities imagined by the participatory design researchers, including me, were addressed through a certain type of participation that eventually empowered the researchers, the media company, and one individual within the organization. This, however, caused a rupture in the social fabric of the organization. While the aspiration to connect all the actors came from the marginalization of young music artists, the participants that benefited nevertheless ignored the vulnerable condition of young music artists as productive mode through which they wanted to partake in different manner. The working rationale of this project resembles how many entrepreneurial-driven innovation projects are run, are made out of small-sized, agile, and flexible networks. For example, how it was based on the idea that it was important to support marginalized civic actors in gaining access to larger arenas and powerful partners that were dominating the culture of public sphere. And I don't think that it's always a good idea to connect the weak with the strong, because the weak often are eaten up by the strong. In hindsight, I and those working in the lab were immersed in the ideals that Boltanski and Ciopello have critiqued as the projective city that emerged as an idea in the 1990s. A projective city is a future and project-oriented city where projects are foremost valued in relation to the extent to which it can create new networks, and where the highly valued and employable person are those who run a multiplicity of transient projects concurrently and who can link different spheres, given their belief in a distributed creativity and innovation. A particular value is ascribed to those that can multiply connections, not the least between unexpected and socially diverging spheres. Those being linked, however, if they are unable to provide connections, are seen as having little value. Such constellations blend voluntary work, unpaid work, paid work, and stable and unstable ways of making living, with the hope that this may lead to yet another project. Participatory design researchers are connectionists, thus become indifferent to the difference between opposed intentions and values, such as pure commercial, profit-driven endeavors, and civic and social engagement, and what connecting them implies politically, socially, and economically. Given that the civic organizations such as grassroots music organizations were unlikely to provide connections and link to what they were deemed valuable partners in the eye of the big actors, while the researchers and other strong actors could do so, meant that the less vulnerable actors increased their value and status, the more vulnerable actors did not. What was thus framed as democratic participation and inclusion was fundamentally proliferating exclusion, marginalization, and further dependency on the middle-class cultural workers and researchers who provide new connections and projects. The point to emphasize, and basically, I'll get to it. The point to emphasize is that one specific site and spaces are rendered as place in need of participation, then design practices such as participatory design embark on such narratives and turn these places into something else. So they highlight certain things and narrate, and the rhetorics kick in a specific way. They compose material, technological, cultural, and social practices into compositions of meaning that can be consumed, exchanged, mediated in favor of specific ideologies and interests. However, as discussed, the participation in active research approaches in practice often presents a kind of facilitation, linking, and engagement with ambiguous relationship to new and dispersed form of governance and entrepreneurship in neoliberal times. That is to say, such projects often produce an economic rationale that keeps them separate from the politics involved in the very same situation, as politics may be understood as an exclusive matter of the state, as Matthew Keane argues, where the cultural, the economic, and political sphere are seen as discrete spheres rather than interacting spheres. This, he argues, often is the case with social innovation projects. Participation is advocated so far as diversify the types of stakeholders, but does not unsettle the form of hegemonic orders that sustain the economic interest of the state, markets, entrepreneurs, and certain classes. Pierre was basically getting them into that class, right? People participate to express their shifting interest and values and to practice their rights in social sphere while remaining recognizable by the very attributed vulnerabilities that facilitate the status quo, vulnerabilities that make designers turn their attention to those bodies in the first place, as potential collaborators or participants in design projects. Participation then becomes a means of affirming the vulnerabilities that could be used to sustain certain practices of power with current neoliberal rationale. By producing multiple choice but only within a given framework, participation adjusts and adapts to the power structure for the sake of facilitating participatory potentials, by giving a sense of collaboration without taking into account the politics of different contradictory positions, hierarchies, conflict, dissent, norms that actually constitute politics. And Malmö is indeed an exemplary projective city that engages in project the social divergence there. Between 2000 and 2011, a total of 345 research and development projects were started in the Helsingborg alone, none which brought improved school results or employment rates. It just made CVs fatter for a lot of people within the municipality and university. A city as many, they reinvented itself into an entrepreneurial city after post-industrial slump through policy-driven endeavors. Some years later, in 2016, the Van Allen Institute, in collaboration with a host of Swedish housing and construction company and energy company and the municipality of Malmö, announced a flash competition. The call was like this: responding to Europe's migration crisis, Opportunity Space is an international design-built competition to create temporary mobile structure that will foster economic opportunity, social inclusion in Malmö, Sweden. The winning team will receive $10,000 and up to $25,000 to implement the proposal in Enskildshagen Park. The competition will bring new and established residents together to produce a public space, hub for education, job assistance, and social inclusion programs that benefit everyone in Malmö. And this was the winning proposal. It resulted in a temporary tent put up for a few weeks and hosted an inclusion festival, and designed by a bunch of people, white people, inspired by Orientalism. Who is in need of participatory support and who can provide the solution by what means is made clear. The perspective put forth is that a set of benevolent, empathetic partners or patrons would save migrants through competition and quick fixes. In short, what is announced and believed to solve the identified issue is a market-driven collaborative endeavor without acknowledging how the issue addressed is produced by global economic forces. And like was mentioned, I'm doing a project on migration. It's called Placed, and it's on the spatial imaginaries of others, of othering. And I'm looking at the ghetto law in Denmark and Lindholm, which was supposed to be a deputation center. So I'll come to that. Patronage and humanitarian reasoning have lately become even more twisted as Denmark's ghetto law and accompanying political economic funding attests to a law that creates a parallel law system where, for example, misdemeanor sentence is doubled if you live in a government-designed ghetto area. They call it ghettos, and they made a ghetto list in Denmark. The funding of 12 billion Danish kroner is geared towards demolishing and replacing public housing buildings in ghetto areas with privately owned housing and businesses. The idea is to break segregation of migrants by making it attractive for middle-class families as well as businesses to mix with migrants and lift them out of poverty. Currently, 6 areas are affected, leading to the dispossession of hundreds of families. Ironically, one of the companies engaged in the restructuring is a Danish real estate company focused on sustainable real estate investment. The former Swedish Minister of Justice has suggested that similar actions could be carried through in Sweden. And with the new government in place, I would not be surprised that this is also happening in Sweden. The point I want to emphasize here is that what is presented as a problem and accepted as an urban design problem, even by companies engaged in sustainability, are principal components of modernity, capitalism, coloniality, and neoliberalism. What this reproduces is the division between forces of accumulation and dispossession, played out by dividing who controls and owns space at time while accumulating wealth within one version of another of global racialist capitalism, where the global north still accrues wealth by dispossessing the global south, as well as the people from the global south living in the global north, as argued by Ida Danevind in relation to Grenfell Tower here in London. Yet it is framed as benevolent endeavors, as patronage with a well-to-do help the poor. Why I bring up patronage is because design and art practitioners, not the least those socially engaged, tend to operate mostly as patrons. And the art historian Hall Foster discusses the difference between patronage versus solidarity in material practice. The distinction is of importance because art and design continuously pit aesthetic quality against political relevance and form versus content. This leads to a modus operandi where belief in aesthetic quality of transgression is upheld to supposedly transform middle-class culture by assuming a place beside the marginalized. As such, patronage perspective aestheticizes politics, which Foster argues plagued some of the neo-avant-garde artists turned ethnographer in the 1980s, and I would say the same goes for much of socially engaged contemporary art and design. And this entails that specialists and certain transgressive talents, often called designers, are seen to produce the future by civilizing and aesthetically upgrading the other, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the artist or designer in dialogue to provide the designer-artist with political relevance. So the artist gets political relevance from the marginalized, and the marginalized is upgraded aesthetically and culturally. We therefore need to ask to what degree we designers align our aesthetic practice to the material practice, techniques and apparatuses of those we work with, and to Hall Foster what counts as solidarity in material practice, not artistic theme or political attitude alone. How am I doing in time? So, and here you see there have been some resistance to what is going on in Denmark, but they have started tearing down, as you see in the left corner, Valmose in one area where they are throwing out a bunch of people. So, on a more positive note, this is another project that I've done, which was partly, I think, more successful, although it had its complications with institutions that we work with. And this was Women Making History. And here I'll focus more on difference through and dislocation. And the invitation also had a question posed by Mbebe. Is it at all possible to build something in common in face of agonism? Mbebe asks. Although I sometimes wonder if we ever will overcome the colonial nightmare we have inherited, I do believe that many of us build something in common. And I believe it's a colonial nightmare that we are facing now, for example, in Sweden and big part of Europe, and historical amnesia. But that it goes unacknowledged often, those kind of alliances. So first of all, we need to acknowledge how cultures are produced through interregional interaction that often lead to new material expression. At the same time, we need to acknowledge the unequal playing field currently and historically. Design tends to favor the spatial over the temporal, ignoring historical forces, which is problematic. So a lot of design is about mapping the now, as the now is only now and not sediments of history, for example. So it ignores historical forces by doing that. In relation to Achilles' question, I would say yes, but only if the forever incompleteness of being is acknowledged in this agonism. I will now turn to Women Making History that I also was involved with to further discuss dialogue, but now with emphasis on difference. I worked on the project together with the Iranian feminist activist and Malmö's first safe haven author, Pardon Ardalan, who instigated the project and connected it to various feminist organizations in Malmö. And she was forced to work with the city archive and the museum. I had actually free funding, so I could play a different part here. In the project, we explicitly aimed for avoiding the patronage model, a helper-help form of relationship, while acknowledging differences in positionality. I will also discuss how the project needed to create its own space and how differences was met by institutional forces in the form of the City Archive and Malmö Museum that hosted the project exhibition next to the main exhibition of Malmö. The project aimed to rewrite Malmö's history, a rewriting that focused on the lives and work of immigrant women over the last 100 years. With a feminist and activist agenda, this meant that I would face hegemonic representation of power. It would face hegemonic representation of power and engage in rewriting categories such as immigrant woman worker, Swedishness, and critically address how they are produced, often in homogenizing frames and monolithic subjects. Over a period of 3 years, we arranged 30 seminars and workshops that dealt with getting rid of simplified framings and sharing stories, which often showed how the women felt they were denied shifting and multifarious forms of identity. Their stories acknowledge how cultures are internally complex and unequally linked, and question the idea of nationally based cultures, which is needed in these increasingly ethno-nationalist times. One such workshop addressed how migrant women work has been and still is framed in Sweden. Sohail Yastampana presented her research on how migrant women had been seen as less liberated and more in need of support to emancipate themselves compared to so-called native Swedish women. This despite the fact that the immigrant women have to a larger extent been wage earners. This is in line with Marie Carlson's research that shows how immigrant women have been framed by an ethnocentric gender equality discourse, wherein immigrant women are seen as tradition-bound and less gender equal than women born in Sweden. This partly relates to the way that gender equality is seen as Swedish progressive success story, and migrants are seen as coming from backwater cultures. A perspective on immigrant women still persists, where immigrant women are seen in need of emancipation by Swedish state interventions from the patriarchal background, which others immigrant women and make their agency invisible. And beside the 30 workshops, seminars, and digging into archives, a project resulted in a magazine, a book, and a massive online platform that we controlled, that the city archive and the museum had nothing to do with. And we fought for that early on because we were afraid of the institutional powers. And they wanted, even though they didn't put 1 hour into that work, they wanted to control how it was designed. Here are pictures from some of the events. This is a magazine and a publication. This is the online platform. And this is the exhibition. Unfortunately, the exhibition became, because it was minimally influenced by the women making history participants, so we actually, it was also interesting in relation to kind of how institutions operate. So the museum said, no, we don't want to intervene at all in the content, so you do all the digging. And we actually wanted their help and their manpower. So withdrawing participation can be a very powerful way of maintaining power. Then we gave them stuff, and with short notice they came back with suggestions about the exhibition, and the women were horrified. We had like two meetings where almost the exhibition broke down, and where I was asked to call upon a third party to negotiate. And this was because it was minimally influenced by the women making history participants and colonized their history writing. The framing and reduction of complexity mainly consisted of reverting to essentialist and compartmentalized multicultural account of identity and of those of stereotypes, where, for example, Muslim women were only portrayed as studying Swedish or cooking in the museum's initial sketches, despite us having provided all the kind of material. As noted earlier, such depiction differed from several accounts in the women-to-women exchange, where hybridity and multi-directionality to a greater extent could be articulated. However, the exhibition was unable to accommodate the women's account of fluid, ongoing hybrid cultural identity, where culture is understood in terms of complex overlaps and in constant motion of exchange through dialogue. The need for simplification, the museum argued, was needed so their main target group could understand it. As such, the museum reverted to essentialist identities and sustaining hierarchies where the other is seen as native and the real as apolitical, instead of acknowledging how anyone one works with are ideologically positioned and do not have essentialist traits. The most powerful co-optation performed by the institutional apparatus was, however, that the women histories were treated as mere progressive items inserted into a frame that could not be transformed but was left intact. Their history became insertion, reminiscent of the notion of amendment, by being added to the official exhibition on the side of the history of the official story of Malmö. So they were, as you can see, the main exhibition was over here, and they were kind of on the side as an amendment. However, in the rest of the project, the workshop, the production of magazines, a book, and online platform, we could discern perhaps reciprocal dislocation, to paraphrase Laclau and Mouffe. For Tarvin, it was important to see the project as a movement that did not have predetermined frames, format, roles, participants, or outcome. As such, It acknowledged how the project would evolve and be articulated through reciprocal dislocation, where the parties working together would be changed. Who and how research and designing was to be carried out is not determined by our professional roles. Not only the researchers conducted research or the designers designed. Neither did she want to work traditionally one-to-one interviewing together stories, which a city archive insisted on doing because that was a very typical way of extracting knowledge. Rather, stories should be shared, not collected, in order for shifts of perspective to occur, and methods of history writing should be developed as the movement grew. On a personal level, I for certain got a new understanding of what white male privilege as a structural system meant, which dislocated my subjectivity. I'm almost done. Perhaps dislocation is not the best word, as displacement is a word that connects to modernism, which has consistently since the 17th century emphasized displacement and the progress which happened through the displacement and dispossession of value extraction and of people and nature. However, I find Laclau and Mouffe's idea of reciprocal dislocation useful because it points at how agonism arise not from totalities, full totalities, but from the impossibility of their constitution that are not fully themselves. So the idea that we are never fully something essential, which is the opposite of notion of real pre-existing oppositions. What is important to acknowledge is that full constitution of identity subjectivity is in fact an impossible task. To build something new together demands thus antagonism, if understood like this. And as Jean-Luc Nancy argues in the inoperative community, love, be it in a form of communion or community, is not the promise of fulfillment, wholeness, or the reunion with a lost original unity, which we often think of when we speak of communion or community. Rather, love shatters us and reveals the impossibility of pure immanence. In the words of Catherine Kellogg, this is because, referring to Jean-Luc Nancy, this is because in love we actually always drawn up out of the narcissistic circle of our notion of perfection, of completion, and of return. Nancy says we are broken by love. In love we find ourselves beyond ourselves, in excess of ourselves. Our experience of love exposes us to being jarred out of the very perfection love seems to promise. Just as importantly, in relation to difference, it is imperative that we reproduce difference, that we don't reproduce difference through separation, which, as Denise Ferreira da Silva argues, was central to modern thought and colonialism. She states, an ethical political program that does not reproduce the violence of modern thought requires rethinking sociality from without the modern text, because only the end of the world as we know it, I'm convinced, can dissolve cultural difference, production of human collective as strangers with fixed and irreconcilable moral attributes. This requires that we release thinking from the grip of certainty and embrace imagination's power to create with unclear and confused or uncertain impressions, which Kant postulated are inferior to what is produced by the formal tool of understanding. So the question of science and how science produces certainty, for example, is a way of such essentialist and separating ways of acting in the world, Silva argues. A way out of such essentialist and separating ways of acting in the world, da Silva argues, is practicing difference without separation. Returning back to dislocation, perhaps better word and reciprocal dislocation, building on Kessevar's concept of design articulation, is to speak of reciprocal articulation, since articulation points towards how every re-articulation is simultaneously a disarticulation, which brings forth the inevitable violence and historical embeddedness of any design act, as argued by Schwartz. So to conclude, design wishes to deal with large societal issues today too often tends to see their design as only belonging to the cultural sphere they operate in, rather than acknowledging how they're part of socio-material condition they're dependent on and embedded in. As such, a clear division between the cultural, political, economic domains is upheld, thus ends up operating with a modernist idea where aesthetic and political are deemed separate. This leads up too often, at least when socially engaged design work with marginalized groups, that it reproduces a status quo it operates with, an economic rationale that is separated from the politics involved in it. Furthermore, because projects tend to spatially map problems as they appear in the now, they tend to dismiss or miss out on how particular issues relates to historically sedimented rationalities of innovation, progress, and reason, which is deemed a reasonable problem. Instead, we need to become better at understanding how and why an issue has become an issue in the first place, and not seldom identify how they are deeply embedded in coloniality. The status quo is reproduced in today's socially engaged design, partly due to the fact that they operate under the patronage model. How to leave that model and socially, culturally, economically, more fundamentally rework the ground of collaboration is a challenge I struggle with. We need to ask what kind of society we want to build. Building something in common is possible if we see and practice culture and movement forever incomplete on a personal, group level, regional level, and where difference is acknowledged as a driver of movement. At the same time, we need to take into account how the playing field is unequal due to historical sediments and how we still live in coloniality, where whiteness privileges need to be scrutinized and resisted. Regarding difference, first of all, we need to acknowledge that conflict and dissensus are in fact inherent in the political nature of any participation. Participation is not about reaching all-inclusive agreement in order to move on. Neither is it about composing different elements and bringing different actors together to envision possible futures, choices and alternatives within a given framework and setting. Instead, the example discussed show that participation is about how taking a part, sharing a part, or acting a part in an already partitioned dynamic environment can point to various unrecognized or less recognized power relations and vulnerabilities involved in any partitioned space produced by any form of participation. As such, a call for participation should always be thought of in relation to how such a call partitions the already existing vulnerabilities into a set of social, economic relations and connections that unequally mobilize certain actors while immobilizing others. Although we're living through some turbulent times, conflict and dissensus are not to be discarded. They are highly productive and vital in moving cultures as long as they operate with non-essentializing reciprocal dislocation. Rather than through difference based on essentialist ethno-nationalism. In fact, I believe, as Stuart Hall wrote, the capacity to live with difference is the common question of the 21st century. And thank you.
Thank you very much. No. Yeah, that was really rich and full and some really thoughtful case studies. And really nice to hear the aspects of failure and in Romeo's talk as well, which is so important and so much more sort of thought-provoking than when it's just, we did this amazing project and it was great. Yeah.